Hundreds of thousands of Russians have faced mass blockings of their bank cards and accounts. This has been happening since the beginning of 26, and it's February now. Banks have sharply tightened control over the movement of funds, explaining this attention as a fight against fraudsters. But what is really going on, and who benefits from it? Who is the main fraudster in this story?
Well, you can come up with different hypotheses. That means, of course, fraud is quite widespread, and that's a well-known story. It's extremely difficult to protect yourself because it's all done in a very sophisticated way. Apparently, bank employees themselves are involved in this, selling client information, and that's why you get calls with a very well-organized information attack. But of course, the government became very interested in this topic, and I think it turned the situation in Russia to its own advantage. Because in September of last year, the legislation in Russia was changed, and the responsibility for the loss of clients' money in cases of fraud was placed on the banks. If your money is stolen by fraudsters, the bank is responsible and must reimburse the funds. And accordingly, as part of this decision, banks were given the right to block any financial transactions or even entire accounts if they have grounds to suspect that the client is under the influence of fraudsters. Why was this done? It was done to prevent a situation that, in economic terms, is called a bank run. A bank run is when depositors rush to withdraw their money, and at that moment the banking system collapses, because in the modern world, the banking system operates on the so-called fractional reserve system. That is, your entire deposit is never just sitting in the bank, it is invested and put to work, but banks set aside certain amounts as reserves. If a particular bank gets into trouble because many depositors come to withdraw their money, then the bank uses its own accumulated reserves to pay them out. But this fractional reserve system can only cover a certain portion of the demand. However, if all depositors rush to all the banks at once, no amount of reserves will be enough and the banks will go bankrupt. That's why this is always a very serious threat hanging over the banking system. But now, in Russia, they've created a system where if a major bank run starts and everyone rushes to withdraw their money, the bankers will say, "Sorry, we suspect you might be under the influence of fraudsters." And they won't give you your money. And you'll have to prove that you're not under the influence of fraudsters.
Whoa.
So basically, let me switch to legal language.
Proceed.
Starting from September of last year, any Russian bank, through the actions and judgment of an operator, has the legal right to declare you legally incapacitated. But before this had to be decided by a court under the influence of, they would start with assessments from expert psychiatrists, and now a girl looks at you with clear eyes and says, "I think you're under the influence of scammers, so we won't give you the money." And the problem is it's not really clear how to challenge this. It got to the point where there were so many of these cases. This has been going on since last year. The issue reached the head of the National Bank of Russia, that is the central bank, Nabulina, and even she was forced to admit that they had gone too far. And there are just too many cases of account blocking, and they block everything. So it's not just some separate account, they block everything, including card accounts where salaries are deposited. In other words, you are completely cut off from your money. And that it's necessary to somehow fix this system, to develop a mechanism, as they say, for appealing the bank's decision to block accounts. But she said that there still isn't any clear, fast, and reliably working procedure for this. So when people tell me about this, write to me. Today someone wrote again, "Yes, of course. My payments have already been blocked twice." They keep blocking payments. Look, at first they blocked cash withdrawals. Then they started blocking transfers to other banks, even to your own accounts. Then they began blocking payments for goods. That is, it would seem the online store issued an invoice you're supposed to pay. They started blocking that too. Well, now it's just who knows what's going on anymore. And so people are already saying, that's it, we're switching to cash. And now Russians understand that their money in banks is, to put it mildly, in a zone of instability. Last year, there was a massive rush, and hundreds of billions of rubles were withdrawn into cash forms. Banks interfere, banks slow things down, but people painfully fight their way through and pull their money out in cash. This is a very interesting topic.
All right. What could this mean for the overall banking system and for the general well-being of citizens?
Well, look, the situation is quite complicated because now people are starting to be afraid to put their money in banks. You deposit your money, they offer you a nice interest rate. But whether you will ever actually get your deposit back is becoming quite an unclear matter. So this is a threat to the inflow of money, right? That's the first thing. For banks, this means that the inflow of money decreases. I get fewer reserves, fewer resources, and I can allocate less of the funds received from depositors to lending, which means losing income. In fact, this is a real problem because when trust in the banking system is lost, it's not just the banks that suffer, the entire economy loses out. But in Russia, the situation is such that no one trusts anyone about anything anymore. Everyone is afraid of each other, and so everything falls apart. Well, how can I put it? The foundation of economic life is trust. Maybe this isn't a very obvious idea to most people, but we economists know it. That the basis of humanity's economic activity is trust in each other. If people don't trust each other, they don't cooperate. And if they don't cooperate, the economy collapses. Because the entire economy is based on the division of labor and cooperation. And that requires trust. That is, you trust in everything. Okay, let me finish this topic for you. You use money, right? What is the basis of your money? None. There's no gold backing it. It doesn't even say anywhere that they're backed by any assets. It's purely trust in the government. In other words, the entire modern global monetary system is fiat money, which is built on people's trust in the government. If people stop trusting the government, they abandon its currency and start using foreign currency. Let me remind you, in the 1990s, this was a widespread practice. Prices were set in so-called units, and people tried to pay in foreign currency. This was fought against for a long time. In some countries hit by crisis, people distrust the local currency so much that transactions are done in gold and so on. Look at Iran, for example. This is happening there as well. So when you undermine trust, you destroy the economy. Right now in Russia, trust is being seriously undermined. No one trusts anyone. And this is, like a cancerous disease for the economy. That's how I would put it.
A cancerous disease for the economy. Now, I have an article I'd like to read to you, and I'd like to hear your thoughts. What do you think this is? Why is it happening? And how significant is it? The largest Russian property developer, Samole, has asked the government for loans, offering a blocking stake in its shares in return. The company tops the list of Russia's largest developers with an annual volume of nearly 5 million square meters, while its closest competitor has just over 4 million. And after news broke that the company had requested government support, Samole's shares on the Moscow exchange fell by almost 7%. How telling is this case, and what does it indicate?
It indicates that your humble servant is not such a bad analyst. An analyst.
Let's put it this way, that's us without the Samolet company.
If you don't praise yourself, you'll end up being spat on.
No. I'm saying we already knew that. About you, yes. But what about them?
I will explain. I'll explain the connection between me and Samolet. About 2 years ago, Professor Kogan, another finance professor from HSE, and I got together. We had a big discussion about the real estate market, and our positions were completely opposite. I said that there was a bubble in the Russian real estate market and that a terrible crisis was coming, which would end with the bankruptcy of many development companies. But Professor Kogan disagreed with me and said that everything was fine there, that he personally knew the managers at Samolet. They're very smart, good guys, highly qualified. They have everything under control. Everything is well thought out. Everything is calculated, and they won't have any problems. Almost 2 years have passed, and now it turns out I saw the situation more clearly than my colleague, a professional financier. The Russian construction industry is in serious trouble. I talked about this. If people haven't watched it, I recommend checking it out today on my channel. The last lecture out of 12 on the state of the Russian economy has been uploaded to YouTube. It covers almost all sectors of the Russian economy, including a discussion about the crisis in construction. So the Russian construction sector is currently in big trouble. It expanded greatly, got, I would say, fat and wealthy when preferential mortgage mechanisms were introduced. And they really took off back then, creating huge capacities. They sold a massive amount of housing at absolutely insane prices. And basically, that's how they got rich. Now, the situation has changed. The preferential mortgage program was canceled starting in 2024. There's no money, the government is supporting it. And immediately, the entire housing sector started to decline. So right now, there's a very, well, let's say high-stakes game going on in Russian construction. Developers are scaring Russians. They say that a crisis is coming, we will build little, there will be little housing, and there will be a terrible housing shortage. Buy now because prices will be higher later. In other words, they're trying to convince Russians that there is never a crash in the real estate market when prices fall. They're even afraid to say those words. but I'm not afraid. I always tell Russians the truth. There was once a rich, cheerful country called Japan. There too, everyone thought that there was little land and the real estate would only get more expensive. But in the early 90s, the Japanese real estate market collapsed, and along with it, the Japanese banking system crashed as well. And Japan entered a decade-long stagnation. So I said that the same thing would happen in Russia. Professor Kobzi disagreed with me on that. But 2 years have passed, and now it's clear that Samole, the largest developer, is in trouble. Housing sales aren't happening, there's no subsidized mortgage, and the mortgage without subsidies is just incredibly expensive. But today, someone published some terrifying figure, let me try to find it, about how long a person in Moscow has to save to buy a one-bedroom apartment. I think I can find it now. I have this number somewhere. Anyway, the numbers are just absolutely shocking. So a person has to set aside something every month. 72,000 rubles a month for 17 years in order to save up enough to buy a one-bedroom apartment. Can you imagine that? That means it's so expensive that no one can afford to buy real estate, which is why sales are doing very poorly. A lot of buildings have been constructed and they're selling very badly. People write to me and say it's a truly frightening sight. There's a large empty apartment building and only a few people live in it. The rest of the apartments haven't been sold. It might sound funny, but I remember once when I went to my clinic. My clinic, for those who know Moscow, is on Frunzenskaya, the clinic of the Presidential Administration of the Russian Federation. At the time, I was an employee of the Higher School of Economics, and we were served there. I'm sitting there, it was evening, I'm in the doctor's office, the window looks out onto the courtyard, and in the courtyard there's this gorgeous building. An elite Moscow building, a multi-story architectural masterpiece, truly stunning, and it's completely dark. Dark, there isn't a single window lit up. I ask, what's going on? She says they built this elite building, but few apartments sold. The rest are empty. Know the price here? Oh my, she says, oh my. More than $10,000 to $12,000 per square meter. Well, she says, some apartments have been sold, but people don't live there. They bought them, how should I put it? Well, as an investment. Yes, that's the case too. That's why a lot of housing has been built, but it doesn't always get sold. But the money has already been invested, and the money invested includes funds borrowed from banks. So the situation is such that things look pretty grim in the construction sector. Apparently, the company is going through really tough times, and they're practically asking the government to nationalize them. What can I say? The largest construction company in Russia. And
exactly how profitable is this venture for the national government? Or is it simply another financial burden?
A burden, you're right, of course. Hardly. I don't think they'll be very interested. There's only one issue why this might happen. The fact is, some very serious people, to put it mildly, have invested in the Russian construction sector. You get what I'm hinting at, right?
Yes.
Because there were huge profits there. And very influential people close to the authorities invested there. So I can't completely rule out that the government might accommodate them. But in principle, it's unlikely because the Russian budget is in such trouble, such a hole, such a deficit right now, that spending money to bail out the builders, I'm not so sure about that. Right now, they need to save those banks. Why? Because the banks invested in the builders. Housing is being built on credit, after all. And only when you finish building and someone has bought it, the money is released from the so-called escrow accounts. Until then, the housing is built with a bank loan, which is paid off when I sell the property. Am I explaining this clearly? That's why all these huge apartment blocks are built with bank loans. But the banks were happy to lend. But who else was there to lend to? Basically, everything in Russia is pretty dull and dreary, and developers were offering high returns. The banks were financing them. Now the houses aren't selling, and the loans aren't being repaid. So it's easy to bankrupt the developer. But then all this unsold real estate will end up in the hands of the bank. And the bank will struggle trying to sell it. That's why the banks aren't selling. The real estate isn't bankrupting the developers, but there's still no money coming back. And that's why the banking sector is facing huge problems. There's no money. And to convince you that this is true, just note that the Russian government, in order to save banks in Russia, not just some minor ones, but what are called systemically important banks. Do you hear how that sounds? They placed 450 billion rubles from the National Wealth Fund as deposits in these banks, so that this money would go to the banks and the banks wouldn't collapse. Basically, even now in Russia, saving the banks is now critical. For example, here is the situation.